real question I have for you, however, is this. What is likely to happen to tax rates beyond 2026 as we move forward in time to 2028, 2030, and beyond? What does your gut tell you? Are tax rates down the road likely to be higher or lower than 39.6? Raise your hand if you think higher. That's most of the people in the room, so I think I'm with you. So for those of you in the room that think that tax rates down the road are likely to be higher than 39.6, my question for you is why? What will we be spending money on as a country that could literally force tax rates to go up? What are the big ticket items? Just yell them out. You got to be more specific. Debt. Okay? What's driving the debt up, though? But what are we spending the money on? Social Security. Medicare. I don't know why this is not advancing like I want it to. Okay, Medicaid. Social Security. By the way, how much debt do we owe? Yeah, we just hit 35. That's a 3 and a 5 followed by 12 zeros. We owe some of that to ourselves. We borrowed some of it from Social Security, but who else do we owe a lot of that money to? China. I don't know if you guys realize, but just recently the U.S. Treasury came out with a new $100 bill. Did you guys see that? I think it's because China's got all the old ones. Sort of a tough crowd tonight, huh? Okay, so we got Medicare. What's driving it up? It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the CARES Act. Does anybody remember what the CARES Act was for? That was for COVID. Did you guys know COVID blew a massive hole in our economy? We had to build a bridge to span that abyss in our economy. That bridge cost $6 trillion. We borrowed more in 1 year than we had the previous 6 years combined. Here's an interesting one right here, pensions. The other day I was talking to a lady. I said, hey, what happens to your pension if your company goes broke? She says, don't worry. No matter what happens to my company, the federal government guarantees I will always receive 2/3 of my pension every year till I die. Folks, that's what we call an unfunded obligation. What's an unfunded obligation? It's a promise the federal government's made that they can't afford to keep. Some experts say that what the federal government's promised that it can't afford to pay is about $125 trillion. But there's a very famous economist by the name of Dr. Larry Kotlikoff out of Boston University, foremost expert in the world on what we call fiscal gap accounting. And what he does is he projects out over the next 75 years everything that we promised to pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt. And then he projects out over that same time frame what we can actually afford to deliver under today's tax rates. He says, guess what? If there's a difference between those two numbers, then your country has a fiscal gap. And that's its true national debt. He says the real national debt's not $35 trillion. It's not even $125 trillion. He says it's much closer to $239 trillion. What does that mean? That means that we would have to have $239 trillion sitting in a bank account today earning treasury rates to be able to deliver on everything that we promised that we can't afford to pay. And the list goes on and on and on. But if you had to pick two things on this list that will make debt go up more than any two other things, which two would you pick? Social Security is one of them. And Medicare. Let's see if we can sort of wrap our brains around why. I'm going to open up a brief parenthesis just on Social Security alone. Can anybody tell me when Social Security was invented? When did they first roll out Social Security? What year? Yeah, it's 1935, linchpin of the New Deal, hallmark of the Roosevelt administration. And when Social Security first started out, how many workers were putting money into the program for every one person that took money out? What did that ratio look like? 12 to 1? Try 42 to 1. You had 42 workers putting money in for every one person that took money out. And back then, how old did you have to be to draw on Social Security? 65. Anybody want to take a stab at what the average life expectancy was back then? It was 62. They didn't even anticipate that the average person would live long enough to ever draw on Social Security. And if you were lucky enough to make it to 65, how long did you draw on Social Security before you tipped over dead? Only a couple of years. So in summary, when Social Security first started out, you had all these people putting money in, hardly anybody taking money out. And when they took it out for 2 years, then they died. Was Social Security pretty solvent when it first started out? You bet it was. It was set up to last forever. And then something happened. Soldiers came home from World War II and they started to do something at a rate at which they'd never done it before. What did they start doing? Having babies. Thank you for the tasteful way in which you put that. They started to have children. In fact, if you look at demographic trends over the last 100 years or so, they look a little bit like this. You start off at the turn of the century with what we call the Henry Ford generation. These are our World War II vets. What did Tom Brokaw call these folks? The greatest generation. And they were followed up by what we call the silent generation, still sort of reeling from the Great Depression. And then what do we call this statistical anomaly right here? These are our baby boomers. So as it turns out, my mom was one of the very first baby boomers. She was born January 17th, 1946. And when was the last baby boomer born? 1964. So we had 18 years of unprecedented procreation. How many baby boomers do we have in our country today? A lot. Thank you for being so precise. It's about 78 million, single largest voting bloc in the country. You'll see why that's important here in a second. Now, did baby boomers have a few children of their own? They had a few. Okay, what do we call these folks right here? Special. We call them Gen X. So I am a Generation Xer. And then we had children of our own. We call this Generation Y. I got 7 kids. That's exactly what I asked myself in the middle of the night. Now, as you look at this chart, did baby boomers, these folks in the middle, did they have nearly as many children as their parents did? Not even close. They had almost 30 million fewer children. So if you were to ask yourself today, how many workers are putting money into Social Security for every one person that takes money out, what does that ratio look like today? It's about 3 to 1. And in another 10 years, what's that going to look like? 2 to 1. And what's the earliest you can draw on Social Security today? What age? 62. And if you start at 62, how long will you continue to draw before you tip over dead? Try 23 years or until age 85. Folks, is Social Security today just a little bit different than when it first started out? You bet it is. It started off as insurance against living too long, and it slowly morphed into a pension program that covers us for nearly a quarter of our lives. Well, how many of you guys have heard of this guy right here, David Walker? Does that name ring a bell at all, David Walker? So David Walker was what we call the Comptroller General of the federal government. What does that mean? That means he was the head of the Government Accountability Office. He's on the board of Social Security. He was a nation's chief auditor. He was basically the CPA of the USA. And he did that for 10 years under Bush and Clinton. The reason I'm telling you this is because David Walker knows more about these numbers than just about anyone else on the planet. And he took one look at the books and he said, hey, you have promised way more than you can afford to deliver. He says, you think Social Security is bad. He says, Medicare is 5 times more expensive. He said, to be able to deliver on these 2 promises alone, he said this in 2008, he said, you would have to double taxes immediately. He said, you don't have to double taxes immediately, but for every year that you postpone doubling taxes, the national debt will grow by $2 trillion per year on average, each and every year, till we hit this magical moment in our country when we have $53 trillion of debt. Folks, what's wrong with a country that has $53 trillion of debt? Where's everything peachy keen? Did you know that if we had $53 trillion of debt, then most of the revenue at that point flowing into the U.S. Treasury under today's tax rates would only be enough to pay the interest on all that debt, let alone any principal, let alone a single dollar for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or anything else we listed on the screen. David Walker was so concerned about this that in 2008, he resigned. And he started to crisscross the country, raising the warning cry to whoever would listen. And in 2010, he wrote a book called Come Back America, in which he sort of diagnosed the problem. And he appeared on NPR to talk about the book. And he told the radio show hostess, he said, hey, look, tax rates have to double or we're going to go broke. And she didn't believe him. So he says, look, I'll give you one 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double, and she couldn't figure out what it was. So they opened up the phone lines, and people started to call in. But nobody could figure out what the one 4-letter word was to explain why tax rates have to double. So I'm going to open it up to you guys. What do you guys think is a one 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double? Math. Math is the 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double. What did David Walker mean by math? Well, basically what he's saying, look, if this is what you're spending, but this is what's coming in, you either have to double what's coming in, cut in half what's going out, or some combination of the two. It's simple math. I remember I was given the same presentation 2 days before midterm elections in a little city called Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And I remember when I was done with my presentation, everyone came up to me and they said, Dave, who should we vote for? Who should we vote for? And I never felt so powerful. And I said, you know what? It doesn't matter who you vote for, because whoever gets elected is going to inherit a math problem, the solution to which involves either doubling taxes, reducing spending by half, or some combination of the two. All right, let's get serious, folks. How many of you guys watch cartoons? I know Scott does. Okay. Tana does. How many of you guys have ever watched a cartoon? Okay. How many of you guys have ever seen The Roadrunner? Okay. Most of you were weaned on The Roadrunner, right? Well, who's always trying to kill the Roadrunner? Coyote, what's his name? Wile E. Coyote, super genius. Well, a couple of years ago, I was watching The Roadrunner. I was with my kids, and in this particular episode, the coyote was trying to kill the Roadrunner, and he was building a bomb with which to do so. And what company makes his bombs? Acme. Now we're cooking. All right, so he's building a bomb made by Acme inside a shed that was also made by Acme. And he was so focused and intent on finishing this bomb that he didn't realize that the Roadrunner had pushed his shed onto a train track. Maybe you've seen the episode. And he was so focused and intent on finishing this bomb that he also didn't realize until the last possible moment that there was a huge freight train bearing down on him. Now, a very important question, most important question I'm going to ask tonight. If you found yourselves on a train track with a huge freight train bearing down on you, what would you do? You get out of the way. Well, let's go back to the Roadrunner. The Roadrunner sees this huge freight train bearing down on him, and instead of jumping out of the way, what does he do? He simply pulls down the window shade, thinking that the act of doing so would make the problem go away. Well, did the problem go away? No, there's a huge explosion, and does the coyote ever really die? No, it's frustrating, right? But as the smoke and fire cleared away, you can see him sort of limping off screen, very much the worse for wear. Well, why did we gather here tonight to talk about the Roadrunner? Well, as Americans who do most of our saving for retirement and what we call tax-deferred vehicles like 401ks and IRAs, we have a very real freight train that's bearing down on us, and it's bearing down on us in the form of what? Higher taxes, and we got a couple of choices of what we can do about it. We could pretend like the problem doesn't really exist. We could pretend like the math to which David Walker referred doesn't really add up. But isn't that a little bit like pulling down that window shade? Or we can implement some strategies starting right now that can help remove us from the train tracks, thereby insulating and buffering us from the impact of higher taxes. So what we're going to do in the balance of our time is we're going to talk about some strategies that you can start implementing right now to help get yourselves off the tracks. Now, as you know, there are millions of different types of investments out there. There's all sorts of different ways to save money for retirement, but I'm here to tell you that no matter where you save your retirement dollars, all of those investments basically fit into only 3 types of accounts. How's that for easy? There's only 3 basic types of accounts within which to save money for retirement. And today we're going to talk about these accounts in terms of buckets of money. The first bucket we're going to talk about is what we call the taxable bucket, meaning every year as your money grows, you get to pay a tax. Who can give me some examples other than these ones right here of some taxable investments? Savings account. 401k is going to be in the next bucket. This one is every year as your money grows, you get to pay a tax. So you got stocks, bonds, mutual funds. Now, how can you tell if you have a taxable investment? What's the tip-off? But how do you know you have to pay taxes? How do they tell you? I heard it every year. At the end of the year, the financial institution sends you that little love letter. It's called a 1099. It says, hey, your money grew this much. Now you got to give a portion of that money back to the IRS in the form of taxes. So the 1099 really is a tip-off. So generally speaking, the growth on the money in this bucket is 100% taxable. Well, if that's the case, why do we even have these types of investments? Well, we have them because generally speaking, they can be very liquid. What does liquid mean? Yeah, get your hands on it, convert it to cash, which means that they make for great emergency funds. What do financial experts tell us about how much money we should have in emergency funds? What have you heard? 6 months were the basic living expenses, like the one number they could actually agree upon. Having said that, can you have too much money in this bucket? Yes, we see it all the time. We see the couple who lived through the Depression. They shuffle into my office. They say, Dave, we got 9 CDs for $100,000 each sitting in 9 different banks, and we think we may be paying too much in tax. Are they paying too much in tax? Yes, because you can have too much money in this bucket. So what's the moral of the story when it comes to this bucket? You can have too much money from a tax efficiency perspective, but you can have not enough from an emergency fund perspective. So what we're looking for in this bucket is just the right amount. And just the right amount is 6 months worth of basic living expenses. Second bucket. Second bucket is what we call the tax-deferred bucket, meaning you don't pay taxes as your money grows. When do you pay the tax? At the very end, when you take the money out. Who can give me some examples of some common tax-deferred investments? IRA. What else? 401k. 403b, 457, SEPs, simples, annuities, you guys get the idea. Now, there's all sorts of different rules that apply to these different investments, but generally speaking, they all have 2 things in common. First thing they have in common, generally speaking, is when you put money in, you get a tax deduction. That's exactly right. So for example, if you make $100,000 per year and you put $10,000 into your 401k, what's your new adjusted gross income? $90,000, exactly right. And the second thing they have in common is the manner in which they're taxed upon distribution. Now, the IRS has a special word that they use to characterize this income when you take it out. What do they call this income when you take it out? Starts with an O. That's right, they call it ordinary income. Ordinary income. So what does that mean? That means that when you put money into that 401k, all you really did was defer the receipt of that income until some point much further down the road, and when you take the money out, at what rate are you taxed? Whatever the rate happens to be in the year you take that money out. So folks, isn't that a little bit like going into a business partnership with the IRS? And every year, they get to vote on what percentage of your profits they get to keep. Does that sound like a good business partnership to anyone? So you could have $1 million in your IRA, but unless you can accurately predict what tax rates are going to be in the year you take that money out, do you really know how much money you have? No, and it's pretty hard to plan for retirement if you don't know how much money you have. Well, let's talk about a third bucket. Third bucket has all sorts of different names. Some people call it tax advantage, some call it tax exempt, some call it tax preferred. Me, I like to call it tax free. Now, I got to warn you, there's all sorts of different investments out there that masquerade as tax free, but I'm here to tell you, to be truly tax free, it's got to qualify in 2 different ways. First way, it's got to really be tax free. And when I say tax-free, I'm talking free from 3 different types of taxes. Free from federal tax, free from state tax, and free from capital gains tax. How many of you guys have heard of municipal bonds? So like 4 of you, okay? Are municipal bonds free from federal tax? Why? I see my thing is jumping all over the place here. Are they free from federal tax? They actually are free from federal tax. Are they free from state tax? Not always. Let's say I live in Wisconsin and I buy a municipal bond from Illinois. Will the state of Wisconsin give me a tax break for that? No, because I'm not benefiting the municipality in which I live. And let's say I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket, and so I buy a mutual fund of municipal bonds, then that mutual fund appreciates in value, and I sell it at a gain. Will I pay capital gains tax on that mutual fund? Yes, I sure will. So an investment that we've been told for years and years and years is tax-free doesn't meet our first basic test. The second thing I'm looking for in a true tax-free investment is when you take money out, it should not count as provisional income. How many of you guys have heard of the phrase provisional income? If you haven't heard of provisional income, don't worry. I gave the same talk to 100 CPAs a couple years ago. How many of them do you think had ever heard of the phrase provisional income? Only two. Only 2 of the 100 CPAs recognize the phrase provisional income, which is scary because what's provisional income? Provisional income is the income the IRS tracks to determine if they are going to tax your Social Security. What counts as provisional income? Well, any 1099s coming out of this bucket count as provisional income. Any distributions at all from this bucket count as provisional income. And 1/2 of your Social Security count as provisional income. So the IRS adds all this provisional income up. And if it's a single person, it adds up to more than $34,000. Or if it's a married couple, it adds up to more than $44,000. Then guess what? Up to 85% of your Social Security can become taxable to you at your highest marginal tax bracket. The LIRP does have an underwriting process because there's a death benefit. The insurance company wants to make sure you're not going to die anytime in the next 10 years, because if you do die in the next 10 years, then it wasn't a good investment for them, right? It's a great investment for you, but not a great investment for them. And that's why I really like to promote a strategy that calls for anywhere between 4 and 6 different streams of tax-free income, because the LIRP has a very specific function. For most of the people in this room, the thing that would appeal to you about the LIRP is that there's a death benefit that doubles as long-term care, okay? If you can't qualify for the LIRP, you have 4 to 5 other streams of tax-free income that don't show up on the IRS's radar that may contribute to you being in the 0% tax bracket. But you do have to qualify, and it may not be as stringent as a lot of people think. I think you get to a certain point in life where most people have high blood pressure, right? Not everybody, but a lot of people do, and maybe you're struggling with this ailment or that. So, but one strategy is you could sort of send what's called a trial application out to 30 different companies, and there may be a chance that one of those companies is willing to roll the dice on you. So that's also an approach. Great question, thank you. This is what I like to say about LIRPs. All LIRPs are life insurance policies, but not all life insurance policies are LIRPs, okay? I wrote a book, Follow-Up to the Power of Zero, it's called Look Before You LIRP, in which I define all of the attributes that an LIRP must have to be truly an LIRP. And an IUL, Index Universal Life, is one of the types of LIRPs that does actually qualify as an LIRP. One of the things that I like about the LIRP is how low the expenses are over the life of the program. You never look at these programs and say, oh, the expenses are really high in the first year, or they're high in the first 5 years. That's like taking a look at your mortgage and saying, most of my money is going towards interest. Hardly any is going towards principal, so I'm not even going to buy a house. When you look at these LIRPs, the expenses we're looking at is over the life of the program. They're going to be a little bit more expensive in the early years. They're much less expensive over the life in the later years. But when you average that over the life of the program, it should cost you between 1 and 1.5% of your bucket per year. By the way, go look at your 401k and see what they're charging you. In a lot of cases, it's between 1 and 1.5% per year. So folks, whatever road you take in life, somebody's getting 1.5%. The question is, what are you getting in exchange for that 1.5%? With the LIRP, what you get is you get a death benefit that doubles as long-term care. So you're getting something very useful in exchange for that 1.5%, plus the tax-free growth, safe and productive. So how does the money inside the life insurance policy grow? There's a number of different ways. The IUL is actually the LIRP that I prefer. That's what I wrote. I make that case in Look Before You LIRP. Basically, what's happening is the growth of the money in that bucket is linked to the upward movement of a stock market index, typically the S&P 500. Whatever that stock market index does, you get to keep up to a cap. It could be anywhere between 10 and 13%. And if that index ever goes down in any given year, they're simply crediting you a zero. So Historically, when you retro test these things, you're getting anywhere between 6 and 8%. Guess what, folks? If you can get 6 to 8% without taking any more risk than what you're accustomed to taking in your savings account, that's a pretty safe and productive way to grow at least a portion of your retirement plan. Health savings accounts are fantastic. The only caveat I have with the health savings accounts is you typically have to spend that money on a qualified health expense. So what I tend to talk about during these events are the things that produce a tax-free retirement income where you can spend it on whatever you want. But the HSA, you know what I love about the HSA? You get a deduction when you put the money in, it grows tax-deferred, you take it out tax-free. So there's very, very few investments that do that. So HSAs are great. It would actually have a huge impact. I mean, they would have a lot of surplus revenue this year, but they would probably find a way to spend it, right? But you want to know what percentage of retirement plans across the country are actually in Roth-style accounts? That's like 5%. 5%. So you've got, for every $20 trillion that you have in IRAs and 401ks, you have $1 trillion in Roth IRAs. Why? Because people are addicted to that tax deduction. They want to get that tax deduction today and postpone the payment of those taxes till some point much further down the road when tax rates are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today. What we say is pay the tax today at historically low tax rates so that by the time the tax rates down the road are much higher than they are today, you've done all the heavy lifting, you can then take that money out tax-free. So the only caveat if you have money in a 401k that you want to shift to the Roth 401k is even when you're 59 and a half, they require you to pay the tax. You can do a conversion inside the 401k plan, but they require you to pay the tax from some other non-401k account. So you got to have a lot of money just languishing maybe in your taxable bucket that you're willing to earmark for the tax on that. But if the math makes sense and we're looking at it in a comprehensive way and the math does add up, then that could be a great move. Any 1099s coming out of your taxable bucket count as provisional income, so that's going to be on long-term or short-term capital gains. Any distributions at all from your 401ks or IRAs count as provisional income, and 1/2 of your Social Security counts as provisional income. The IRS adds it up. If as a single person that's more than $34,000, then at that point up to 85% of her Social Security would be taxable if she's single. And if she's married, anything over $44,000, then up to 85% of her Social Security will be taxed. So that capital gains is a 1099, and that counts as provisional income. So that would, in that year, potentially cause Social Security taxation. But I got to remind you that people hate paying taxes. Well, guess what? You should jump at the opportunity to pay taxes at historically low tax rates, because I can guarantee you that the tax rates we experience today are not likely to stick around for long. Capital gains, ordinary income, whatever side of the ledger you're looking at, not likely to stick around long. What I explain in The Power of Zero, if you read the entire book, is that in a rising tax rate environment, there's a perfect amount of money to have in your tax-deferred bucket. You want to have a balance that's low enough that at age 72, when the IRS forces you to take that money out, whatever they force you to take out is equal to or less than your standard deduction in that year, but also low enough that your provisional income prevents you from paying tax on your Social Security. So for most Americans, if you don't have a pension, that's going to be about $350,000, give or take. Everyone's different, but that's sort of a ballpark number. The only way to get to the 0% tax bracket if you do have a pension is to check to see if the company that's offering that pension gives you what's called a lump sum distribution option, which allows you to take the value of that pension and roll it into an IRA, and then convert that IRA to a Roth IRA. And then once you're in the Roth IRA, you can use some financial instruments to create your own pension out of that tax-free bucket. So that's possible. Now, if you work for a school or a government or what have you, most of them don't have that option, in which case read, I believe, Chapter 7 of my book, The Power of Zero, on pensions. You worry about the things that you can control. You don't worry about the things that you can't. It could be you may be in a situation where you can't control the pension. Pension will cause Social Security taxation.
Don't worry about that. Worry about all your other tax-deferred assets and getting those shifted to tax-free. Worry about the things that you can control. Don't worry about the things you can't. Yeah, so not only does your standard deduction get chopped in half, but your tax brackets also get chopped in half, which means you are going to rise into those higher tax brackets a lot faster. So you may not believe that tax rates are going to double, but if your spouse dies, you are going to experience an immediate doubling of tax rates.
Yeah.